At 10:58 a.m. on Wednesday, April 7th, 1926, the 50-year-old daughter of the former Lord Chancellor of Ireland stepped out of a crowd, drew a Model 1892 French revolver, and shot the Prime Minister of Italy, Benito Mussolini, in the face. Had she done the same a decade later, she might have been proclaimed a hero. Had her aim been better, she might have changed history. As it is, the attempt on the life of one of history's greatest villains is history that deserves to be remembered. A report of the incident was printed in the Australian newspaper The Week on April 16th. In a speech before the International Congress of Surgeons, which was attended by 600 delegates, Signor Mussolini praised the surgeon's heroic fight against death, mentioning that I myself have experienced your marvelous skill as a soldier in the Great War. Later, on leaving the capital, accompanied by a number of doctors, Signor Mussolini was loudly cheered by the crowd. He acknowledged the tributes with a Roman salute. As he crossed the square towards his motor, an elderly woman in dark clothes dashed from the crowd, whipped out a revolver, and fired, wounding Signor Mussolini in the lower part of his nose. The Glasgow Herald reported that her shot was followed by a short report, like the rapping of a stick, hardly heard amid the noise of the cheering crowd. The attempt came close to success, but fate seemed to intervene. Historian Jennifer Rosenberg writes on ThoughtCo. At nearly that exact time, a student band started playing Giovinezza, the National Fascist Party's official hymn. Once the song started, Mussolini turned to face the flag and snapped to attention. The Saskatoon, Canada Star Phoenix explained, at that very moment, Mussolini, as is his habit, threw back his head. As she tried to pull the trigger a second time, the bullet stuck in the chamber and the gun jammed. The Irish Daily Mail explained in 2018. It was often said that Mussolini hadn't turned at the moment that he was shot, that he would have been killed. The Week writes, 3 officers immediately seized her, preventing further shots, and protected her from the fury of the crowd, who tried to lynch her. Her survival was, in fact, as remarkable as that of Il Duce. Reporter Freya Johnston noted in The Telegraph in 2010, when Ennio Zamboni, age 15, fired his automatic revolver at Mussolini a few months later in Bologna, he was immediately lynched, strangled, knifed, and shot. While initially identified as a Russian, the identity of the woman was rather shocking. The white-haired lady in black was an Anglo-Irish aristocrat. The Manchester Guardian reported, the name given by Signor Mussolini's assistant, Violet Albee Gibson, is that of the second daughter of the first Lord Ashbourne and sister of the present peer. Gibson's father had been the Lord High Chancellor of Ireland, who had been elevated to the peerage as the Baron Ashbourne. Michael Shiles McNamee wrote on the website of the BBC, her story is made all the more unlikely by the circumstance of her birth. The daughter of Anglo-Irish aristocrat Baron Ashbourne, Lord Chancellor of Ireland, the country's highest legal office at the time, she was a debutante in the court of Queen Victoria. The two could hardly have been more different. Lucy Hughes Hewitt wrote in The Guardian in 2010, in 1926, at the time of their pathetic encounter, Mussolini was a splendid figure of a man who liked to display his muscled torso shirtless. Violet was tiny, 5 foot 1 inch, and emaciated, unmarried and not much loved. 50 years old but looking 60, and odd enough in her behavior to have been twice admitted to sanatoria for the mentally ill. Whether she was in fact insane would become an issue, in some ways a convenient one, given the reaction at the time. Enrico Ferri, a renowned Italian criminologist, wrote in a 1928 edition of the Journal of the American Institute of Criminal Law and Criminology. The great sense of horror aroused by the attempt on Benito Mussolini's life by a woman of 50, Violet Gibson, and the disastrous results which might have followed it, should not on any account, by concentrating our attention on the misdeed, prevent us from studying the author of the criminal attempt and considering what may be her legal liability. In historical retrospect, it seems a bizarre take. Great sense of horror at shooting Hitler's accomplice? Disastrous results which might have followed by killing the architect of Italian fascism before he could help to spark the deadliest war in human history and precipitate the deaths of millions? But as Johnston wrote in 2010, before his invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, the Italian leader was feted by most of the British press and idolized by the ruling class. Evidence of his brutality, extravagance, and instability was politely ignored. The lens was different in 1926. Informed of the situation by the Papal Secretary of State, His Eminence Pope Pius XII was reported to have voiced his joy and satisfaction that the Almighty had prevented the attempt from having grave consequences. The Australian newspaper The Week reported that the British Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs, Sir Austen Chamberlain, sent Mussolini a message saying, I am horrified to learn of the abominable attempt on your life. My wife joins in congratulations on your escape." The British ambassador passed on the regards of the king, and W.T. Cosgrove, president of the Irish Free State from which the would-be assassin hailed, noted that the infamous attempt has caused much indignation here. Perhaps the most personal reaction, though, came from the family of Miss Gibson. The Manchester Guardian reported that her brother, Lord Ashbourne, sent a telegram regretting the incident on behalf of her family. The family then offered their explanation. A spokesman for the family described her to a Reuters reporter as a lady of some eccentric temperament. Hughes Hallett reported that Lady Ashbourne, her sister-in-law, said that Miss Violet Gibson has not been in full possession of her faculties, but has been subject to intermittent mental crises. Her mental state was reported on widely. The Guardian was quick to note that a relative had said that before going to Italy, she'd been in a mental institution. A previous attempt at suicide in 1925 was also widely reported. Johnston explains, a year before the attempt on Mussolini, hoping to die for the glory of God, she shot herself in the left side of the chest, but somehow contrived to miss her heart. The bullet lodged in her shoulder blade. The Adelaide Australia Chronicle noted that in her own country, probably she would not again have had a chance to handle firearms. The Chronicle continued that it is said that she chose to live in Italy because it was a land without lunacy laws, and the Guardian reported that relatives have tried to have her put in a nursing home, but they had been told that under Italian law that was not permissible in the case of persons subject to intermittent insanity. Other reports suggested that she planned to commit suicide after the assassination attempt. The Sacramento Union reported that she had in her possession a bottle containing iodine mixed with some other liquid. The authorities are of the opinion that she intended to drink the mixture after her attempt against Mussolini, but either changed her mind or was unable to carry out her intention owing to her overwrought condition. She was commonly described as being a religious fanatic. The Week reported that she had told Italian authorities that an angel had strengthened her hand to kill the Pope or Mussolini, and that it would have been better to kill the Pope. The Adelaide Chronicle reported that she told police in broken Italian, "I don't know why I wanted to kill him," writing that she expressed no regret for her action, nor did she seem to realize her position. Ferry comes to the conclusion that she was, in his words, neither solely criminal nor mad, but is an insane criminal. Thus, he writes, the above description of Miss Gibson's psychology leads us to two definite conclusions, which furnish very positive evidence for the penal courts to draw from. One, that she was on the occasion of the attempt of the 7th of April, was mentally infirm and acted consciously, but was devoid of her free will power to act. And two, that she, however, must be considered as a dangerous subject, and in consequence should be deprived of her personal liberty. Ferry would, in fact, find that result, but not through the Italian penal courts. The website of the Dublin City Council writes, following 18 months of imprisonment and interrogation in Italy, plus investigations into an international conspiracy, a deal was brokered by Mussolini and the British Foreign Office. Mussolini himself pardoned her, and she was sent back to England. To underline the oddity, Hughes Hallett notes her brother Willie, an enthusiastic member of the Gaelic League, when he came out to Italy to retrieve his sister, aroused the suspicions of the police by wandering around the Colosseum in a saffron-colored kilt. Once she was returned to England, the Irish Daily Mail explains, she was incarcerated in St. Andrew's Hospital in Northampton, an asylum for the mentally ill. It was a convenient answer, as Hughes Hallett notes, to try to kill the fascist leader when the King of England had just awarded him the Order of the Bath, and British journalists were reporting gladly that his trim, handsome, black-shirted lads were doing a fine job of keeping down the Bolsheviks, might be the act of a madwoman. But was she really insane? McNamee argues that maybe not. For some strange reasons, Violet Gibson became a sort of an embarrassment. She got shunned. They tried to say she was insane to hide the shame. The Dictionary of Irish Biography explains, the press portrayed her as a confused eccentric in the grips of religious mania rather than a would-be assassin. Her time in an asylum was emphasized, and her motivations were never depicted as political. Her family and the British authorities were keen to promote this narrative. But there was reason to question it. The Dictionary of Irish Biography continues. In her room at the convent, Gibson had amassed a collection of newspaper cuttings critical of Mussolini and others outlining his movements. She also had a box of bullets. The origin of the revolver, her second, was never determined. The lead detective investigating the case believed Gibson was feigning madness and had not acted alone, but possibly in collaboration with Catholic modernist dissidents from the poor Trastevere neighborhood. For political reasons, however, his superiors preferred the lone madwoman story. Author Frances Stonor Saunders writes in her 2010 book, The Woman Who Shot Mussolini, that societal expectations played a role. Misogyny and stigma surrounding mental illness played a role in silencing Gibson's story for decades. The Irish woman's contemporaries labeled her as insane instead of acknowledging her intellectual qualms about Mussolini's dictatorship. Was insanity just a convenience excuse all around, or was there both method and madness? Johnston writes, no one in Britain or Italy appears to have entertained the idea that she might have been at once politically engaged and mentally unhinged, perhaps because such a theory would have reflected badly on the character of Il Duce himself. In any case, the website of Dublin City Council writes, she was locked up in a British lunatic asylum for the rest of her life. For 30 years, she battled for her release, writing letters to the authorities, politicians, friends, Churchill after Italy declared war on Britain, and to Princess Elizabeth. But her letters were never posted. And regardless of whether she was mad when she fired the shot, she certainly was so later. Hughes Hallett writes, but 20 years later, once the Duce had been defeated and lynched in his turn and hung up dead by his heels, her friend suggested that Violet surely should be released. Too late. History might have endorsed her political judgment, but 2 decades in the madhouse had done nothing for her sanity. She belabored fellow patients with a broom handle. She believed her moods created the weather. She never came out. And what had she accomplished? Historian Brian Brennan wrote in the Irish Independent in 2010. Many years later, Violet Gibson was to boast that of all Mussolini's would-be assassins, she herself was clearly the most intelligent. The Irish woman may well have been the cleverest, but it didn't do her much good. The Irish Daily Mail writes Violet Gibson came very close to changing the course of 20th century history. But how had it been shaped? Johnston writes, she had, as she would later boast, shaped history that morning, though not in the way that she would have liked. Public sympathy and admiration for the saintly statesman exploded in the wake of her attack, one of 4 attempts made on his life in less than a year. The Week noted the news of the attempt on Signor Mussolini's life evoked indignation throughout the country. The townspeople in many places paraded the street, cheering Signor Mussolini, and solemn Thanksgiving services for the escape of Il Duce were held in some towns. The Guardian reported when at last the Duce emerged with a bandage across his face, every method of applause broke out simultaneously, and only with difficulty could silence be kept while he delivered his address. This speech and its reception was surely Signor Mussolini's greatest triumph since the March on Rome. The Irish Daily Mail continues, the only effect of her attempt to kill Mussolini was to make the Italian dictator even more popular. Moreover, she had facilitated his brand of leadership. While Mussolini publicly forbade any acts of vengeance and appealed for calm, the Guardian reported that in another 10 minutes, lorries full of carabinieri appeared careening through the streets. Shortly afterwards, numbers of youths donning black shirts and with sticks in hand paraded the streets in small squadrons. The Star Phoenix reported fascist groups marched to the plants of several opposition newspapers and either wrecked or burned them. Crowds of young men carrying walking sticks marched in procession with military precision through the main thoroughfares, chanting national airs or shouting in unison imprecations against those who dared to impede the progress of the fatherland. It would become a continuing trend. The Wichita, Kansas Plain Dealer wrote that every time Mussolini makes one of his historic declarations in public, someone will shoot at him. Every time someone has fired at him, Mussolini attempts to play the role of the fearless hero, who in the very climax of personal peril remains calm and serene. But instead, he used those attempts to crack down further. After another attempt, the Plain Dealer notes how many political opponents of the dictator were killed or wounded, how many homes of the socialist, trade union, and Catholic clubs were wrecked, and what other destructive work has been done since may be learned later on, because press censorship is now the law in Italy. In short, all opposition to the fascist government will be crushed out of existence. But the Plain Dealer in 1926 made what turned out to be an optimistic prediction. His end is near. Conditions as they exist in Italy today cannot last long. Mussoliniism will be its own gravedigger and its own undertaker. That would eventually be the case, but only after nearly 2 decades and world war. And of course, this raises the obvious question. What if she had succeeded? The Irish Daily Mail noted that it's often said that had she succeeded in killing Mussolini, that it would have been the end of his strongman era in Italy, and his fascist successes would not have gone on to inspire Hitler to create the Nazi regime in Germany. But that might be optimistic. Perhaps she would have simply created a martyr that would have allowed someone else to do the same, or even worse. Of course, we can't ever know, because what happened, happened. History is history, and this history was decided, as they say, by a nose. Violet Gibson died alone in the asylum on May 2nd, 1956, at the age of 79. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.